Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 177, and I am the show's host, Kyle. Joining me on today's show is the friend of the show, most frequent guest, Will Porter. Will, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Kyle. Thank you for having me back on again. Appreciate it.
Well, great to have you on. I know the audience likes it. The downloads always go up when Will Porter's coming on the show. So, for those of you out there, who want to share the work of myself and Will Porter, it can be found at libertarianinstitute.org. Of course, this show is at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Will is a freelance journalist, and his work could be found at Consortiumnews, antiwar.com, The Daily Sheeple, and as I said, libertarianinstitute.org. Will is an expert and, is a deep researcher into American foreign policy and Mideast affairs, and we're going to be talking an awful lot about that on today's show. What me and Will were planning on doing on today's show is talking about the three scenarios where Trump is actually, at least has floated and has bought into some good ideas, and that is Syria, Russia, and North Korea. Don't normally think about inviting Will Porter on this show and discussing Trump in any kind of positive way, but that's a little bit of what's going to happen here today. Will, generally, have you seen these as, kind of positives?
Yeah, at least, I've approached them cautiously, because as we've seen, there's sort of been, some, what's the opposite of a silver lining, some little ominous notes in it. But no, I definitely think these are generally, I like to see this kind of thing.
Right. These are the kinds of things, like I said, Syria, Russia, and North Korea, where there are things going on in American foreign policy that aren't trending in the complete wrong direction. And so we'll start off with Syria, where last week Donald Trump said, and I believe he was in Ohio, giving a campaign-style speech, that the U.S. troops would be leaving Syria very soon, and talked about withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. In that speech and then the immediate aftermath, the media kind of reacted by saying that, this was just a campaign speech and, he was just out there talking. But then it turns out that this is something that Trump has been talking about behind closed doors for a matter of a few weeks. He doubles down on it and says it again. I believe he even put out a tweet that I quoted on both Immersion News and my daily news roundups up here at libertarianinstitute.org. Basically just Trump saying that, hey, the U.S. troops are going to get out of Syria. And then just a couple days ago, we get the bad news that it looks like Trump's advisors talked him into staying and U.S. troops will not be leaving Syria. So, well, I guess my first question was going to be, what are the chances that the U.S. leaves Syria, in somewhat short time frame? But I guess still I could ask, does it look like Trump maybe has a plan to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria? Do you think this is possible? Do you have any predictions on what's to come for the U.S. peace process in Syria?
It's really hard to say with Donald Trump. He sends so many mixed signals. I think that's a pattern throughout this administration. And so, we've seen a lot of blustery, hostile things that Trump has done towards Syria, such as the bombing of that Syrian airfield last year. In 2017.
Right, that was almost a year ago, or was a year ago from today. It was right in the aftermath of that attack on April 4th on Khan Sheikhoun that me and Will discussed on the show several times. But it's just crazy. That almost exactly a year later, Trump is moving in the exact opposite direction in Syria.
Right, and I mean, in the last year, between now and then, there's been a lot of negative things that have happened in Syria. We had Rex Tillerson. We covered this on this show. Rex Tillerson coming out and announcing that the creation of a 30,000 man Kurdish-backed border force. And I almost wondered when Trump came out and announced that he wanted to get out of Syria, I wondered if maybe this had something to do with Tillerson's firing, with his dismissal, or with him leaving his position as Secretary of State. I have no idea whether that's the case. And I know that Rex Tillerson and Trump had, butted heads on the Iran deal. In that case, Tillerson was the better one. He actually seemed to be more warm to the deal. Whereas in this case, Tillerson seemed to want to stay in Syria, at least based on that speech. It seemed to be part of his vision for American policy there. And so how likely is it that Donald Trump is actually going to do this? I really can't say. It doesn't appear to be too likely, especially because his advisors have now come out and said, no, we're not doing that. We're not actually, we can't do that. We have to stay until ISIS is defeated, they say. However, that's kind of like a nebulous, unclear, how long is that going to be? That you could conceivably use groups, militant groups in Syria as an excuse to stay indefinitely. So who knows?
Right. Well, there's so many different militant groups in Syria. I mean, the Idlib province of Syria has been turned into al-Nusra stand at this point. I mean, it is just completely filled with them. I think for the most part, most of the Shia civilians have evacuated in the different kinds of negotiation and deals going on. And so if you're looking for a jihadist presence in Syria, thanks to the Iraq War, the Libyan War, and now the Syrian Civil War, in which I guess in the Iraq Civil War, the United States was mostly fighting against the jihadists, but then, took their sides in both Libya and Syria, has created a massive jihadist presence in the Middle East, and including Syria. And so, as you said, if you're looking for a rebel group, if you're looking for somebody who swears loyal to al-Baghdadi and the Caliph, or to Osama bin Laden, you're going to find enough of them in Syria.
Right. I mean, if you look at the sort of experience with Iraq, we fought, it's the same group. Al-Qaeda of Iraq is ISIS, basically. And we never were able to defeat that insurgency. We were never able to make them go away. And so if the same rationale is to, until this group is gone, until we've defeated them, who's to say how long that's going to take?
All right. So, Will, I'm going to ask you the question that the, right-wing media, Sean Hannity, would ask you if you said that, and that is, ISIS, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was defeated in Iraq in 2010, 2011, and it was Barack Obama who left that created the problem.
Right. Of course, this argument often ignores the fact that it wasn't just Barack Obama's decision to leave. It was the Iraqi government's insisting, because of the way that the Americans had conducted themselves in the country. They didn't give us the bases that Bush had wanted in Iraq. And they insisted that Iraqi law apply to American soldiers. And so they act like Obama, like this is a criticism of Barack Obama, of course, but like they act like this is up to him. But no, of course, the real, I think, argument there, the counter argument, is that no, it was the presence in Iraq in the first place and the way we conducted ourselves during that war that led to the rise of a group like AQI in the first place. And no, it wasn't just leaving that made them, stronger, made them come back. They never went away in the first place. Like they, as long as we stayed there, that was going to be a reason for them to stay and to build themselves to fight us. But of course, then it became its own movement with its own momentum. And so, yeah, no matter what we do now, there's, this group is around.
Right. And there's a lot going on, especially during the Iraq surge. Like, they were actually paying off some of the Sunni tribes to keep them, from not committing violence. And so I guess how much, protection money are you willing to pay, the Al-Qaeda linked factions there to keep them quiet? And then the other issue you have, and this was admitted by the Obama administration, is that they knew that propping up the Sunni insurgency, or the, Sunni resistance to the Assad government in Syria, would create the Islamic State. And that, that's what AQI transformed into, right? And so the Obama administration knew that they were helping the enemy in Iraq the whole time they were helping what they claimed were our allies in Syria, but were really just jihadists. Sometimes it disguises moderates.
Right. Yeah. Obama basically doubled down on all the mistakes, or whether you want to call it deliberate or a mistake or not, all the terrible things the Bush administration did in Iraq in empowering AQI. Obama then sort of doubled down in Syria when they crossed the border there to fight in the war and backed their allies and groups like that. Right.
Bush made them hate us, and then Obama poured a bunch of weapons into the area. So now we have a huge mess. But the other thing, this is a point that especially the right-wingers will make on the Syria issue, is that we can't leave because doing so will allow a land bridge to form from Tehran to Beirut, and then Israel is just done.
Yeah, I like Scott Horton's response to this, that, like, have they ever heard of airplanes? Like, they don't need a land bridge to transfer things from Iran to Lebanon or whatever. But no, our presence in Syria, like, what are we going to do? Like, annex the country and, take it over or something, conquer the place? No matter what, Iran is going to have some tie to the Assad government. And so I guess if they're saying, I don't know, is anyone in the administration arguing that we have to oust Assad still? Because I didn't think that was the line at this point. However, if the whole goal is to keep Iran out, it seems like you'd have to put in some whole new regime to be totally hostile to Iran to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I mean, if everybody could pull up a map, and is this a Sykes-Picot line between Iraq and Syria, Will?
Yeah, or at least that's like, it's based on it. It's not exactly where the Sykes-Picot line was, but yeah, that's what they call it.
Right. It's a massive portion of the Iraq-Syria border, and you would have to control the whole thing and the whole, portion of this on the other side in Syria to prevent, that land bridge from being taken. It's much more than just what the United States now controls, through our proxies, the Syrian Kurds and the YPGs in Syria, right? And so I don't really understand how this whole land bridge narrative isn't already in it. If it's happening, it's already happening because the Syrian Assad territory already borders the Iraqi state. So I just don't get it. I'm sorry, that was just like a little digression, but I just don't get how the land bridge would even be a thing.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a silly argument.
Right. And then the last thing you'll hear is about, the United States backstabbing the Kurds. And in fact, I talked about this on, I believe, 2 shows ago about MSNBC lying about Russia. And just, we had that reporter, journalist, NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, asking the general commanding U.S. forces in Syria, General Braga, isn't it going to hurt you as a man to stab your Kurdish partners in the back? When the Syrian Kurds already stopped fighting ISIS to go fight the U.S. NATO ally in Turkey. I mean, if you spin it that way, it seems an awful like the Kurds gave up on the U.S. before the U.S. gave up on the Kurds.
Right, and the U.S. should have seen for the entire time what kind of complications that would create with Turkey by getting in bed with the what they call the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which I'm sure we've discussed many times in this show. But yeah, backing those Kurdish militias, absolutely, like from day one, from the day that those weapons shipments were announced to the Kurds, Turkey was like going nuts and freaking out about it. And so we should have expected that something along these lines would have happened, between the Kurds and Turkey not taking kindly to this building of Rojava and all this stuff in northern Syria.
Right. This doesn't necessarily seem to be a problem that's going to go away at all ever anyways. It's not like Turkey's like, well, we're going to hate the Kurds until the Syrian civil war is over and then we're done with it. They see the Syrian YPG as the same thing as the PKK, with which Turkey is fighting a terror war against in their own country. And they've even gotten the United States and the rest of the international community to label the PKK as a terrorist group. And so, I don't know. I just have, that's the other thing, is that it's not like a concrete problem, that there's some solution to. It's always going to be a problem. So what, the United States has to keep 2,000 troops in Syria forever to keep the Turkey from invading our ally state there? That just doesn't make any sense either.
Right. We have to keep a protection force for the 30-man Kurdish protection force that's supposed to protect the border. Like, it's crazy. That's going to inflame tensions with our ally Turkey and NATO. You can just see how preposterous this is. This is not a sustainable policy. This is not something that's going to end in peace or resolution or, with a safer or, a region with less conflict.
Absolutely. And nobody else in the region wants the Kurds to have an independent state in Syria. And not that should necessarily make a difference, but it's really going to cause the United States a lot of problems with the Iraqi government and the Iranian government. And so it seems like an awful lot, strategically for the United States to give up to continue to defend the Kurds when they've shown that ISIS is not their first priority. Right.
Yeah. So I definitely think, Donald Trump was like, if this is his instinct to leave, then he's absolutely right for, all these reasons we're laying out here.
Right. And then the last thing I want to ask you is that, and this is somewhat irrelevant because Trump has kind of kicked the can down the road on Syria, but what impact do you think John Bolton will have as Trump's incoming national security advisor? As the airing of this podcast, I think we're within like 72 hours of possible doomsday. I say that as somewhat hyperbolic when John Bolton becomes national security advisor. So what do you think he will be telling Donald Trump to do or about the situation in Syria?
Or something, which he has done on North Korea and Iran and other issues. However, given that the supporters of the Assad regime are not only Russia, who Bolton is a hawk toward, but also the Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, who Bolton is just completely unhinged about. I think he's probably the most hawkish toward Iran out of any of the countries, perhaps. And so on Syria, you can only imagine that he's going to push this line of the Israeli line that this is going to, if Iran gets a land bridge in Syria, this is going to allow them to smuggle weapons to Hezbollah, and that's going to, collapse Israel and be a mortal threat to Israel. So you can almost guarantee that John Bolton supports that kind of narrative. And when John Bolton was the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security Affairs, super long title he has there. He served in that position from 2001 to 2005, I think. And in that role, he came out and said and put Syria as part of a broader axis of evil. Because in 2002, the Bush administration made Iran, Iraq, and North Korea this preposterous axis of evil. And John Bolton kind of later elaborated on it and said that other countries too were part of a broader axis of evil, and he included Syria in that. So that again, I think, gives us some idea of what Bolton's leanings would be on Syria. I think he's obviously very hawkish toward the Assad regime, and the fact that Iran and Russia are both assisting the Assad regime and have been since 2015 at least, that's going to make him even more hawkish on this.
Yeah, John Bolton's secondary axis of evil, or whatever you want to call it, was just as ridiculous, if not more, than George Bush's, the original one, including Syria, Libya, and Cuba as that axis of evil. Completely insane, this John Bolton character. All right, before we get too bogged down like the U.S. military in Syria, let's move on to the Russia situation. On March 20th, Putin was reelected, and so Donald Trump picked up the phone in customary fashion and gave Vladimir Putin a call. And during that conversation, we found out that Trump floated the idea that Vladimir Putin should have a summit with the Americans, and that could possibly occur at the White House. And so, in one way, this seems like a great thing to me. Donald Trump inviting Vladimir Putin over for dinner. I say, yes, please, and roll out the red carpet. And never would I be happier to have my tax money spent on steak than if it was a peace steak, a very well done peace steak eaten by Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So, Will, what do you think here? What are the prospects that these talks actually occur? I guess we could start there.
Right, as you said, yeah, it's not concrete yet. They haven't set a date or anything. However, it does seem like they're moving forward with it. It appears like they're kind of they mean it when they say they want to talk. And as you said, yeah, they might actually meet at the White House. Now, I don't know. This is kind of obviously the meeting itself is great news. Like, that absolutely should happen. I'm all for anything that might lead to détente. However, something I worry about with this potential summit is that Trump is going to be pushed into sort of a more uncompromising position on the Russia question, because he kind of has been hemmed in a little bit. He has been forced in public to give some capitulation to the whole Russiagate narrative, which obviously we're very resilient to. Like, we don't accept a lot of what's claimed as part of the Russiagate story. And so I worry, though, that Trump will be sort of pushed in that direction further and, be pressured into confronting Putin over his, role in the election. However, Trump has come out in the past in speeches and stuff and described Putin as saying that, he insists that he didn't do this. Putin told me that he's not responsible. Every time we talk, he says he's not responsible. And so, to me, it's unclear. Again, I think there's been, mixed signals. As you referred to, Trump congratulated Putin on his electoral victory, which who knows how meaningful that is. I don't really know how free elections are in Russia, but still, that was a good sign. But then there's been other stuff too. There's been, the expulsion of the embassy officials, the 60 Russian embassy officials who were accused of spying, accused of being intelligence agents, and it was all also over that whole Novichok alleged assassination attempt in the UK, which I know you've covered on your show here. And so, yeah, there's mixed signals. It's not clear how Trump is going into this potential meeting.
Yeah, I have to say that the policy of Donald Trump, well, all of Donald Trump's policies I find fairly confusing, but the Russia-Putin policy over the past month or so has been really, really confusing to me. I mean, here again, we have this situation in Syria where realistically the United States and Russia could come together to force some kind of agreement between Assad and the Kurds, right? I mean, the U.S. is the dominant power in Kurdistan. Russia is the dominant power in the, Assad Syrian state area. I can't imagine that there's not work to be done here that could be found to, form somewhat of an autonomous region in Syria and Kurdistan and, to resolve a lot of problems in the Syrian civil war. I feel like, there's a lot of work to be done on nuclear weapons. Obviously, Vladimir Putin, I believe it was March 1st, rolled out Russia's new nuclear capabilities, including those hypersonic cruise missiles that are, kind of capable of bypassing all of America's missile defense systems and really change the balance of power in the world to make it, back to mutually assured destruction, at least, if not giving Russia close to a competitive edge on the, nuclear weapons war, should we ever decide to start launching those weapons and commit genocide against the world. But I don't know. It just seems like there's all these things that everybody seems to be agreeing are good things and we're moving towards. And then we have the, poisoning of Sergei Skripal in the UK, and Theresa May immediately points the finger at Russia, and everybody goes along in complete hysteria, and Trump kicks 60 Russians out of the United States and closes the Seattle consulate. I don't understand how all these things are happening at the same time. It seems that Trump should be able to prioritize something. And okay, maybe even if the Russians did poison and kill Sergei Skripal, which I'm even convinced more now than ever is untrue. But even if they did, why let that get in the way of nuclear detente? Why let that get in the way of resolving the Syrian civil war? This was a former Russian double agent. I mean, I guess in a way, like, I don't want to be flippant about life and saying that, the guy's life doesn't matter, but him and his daughter may make a full recovery. So, I don't know, prioritize the war in Syria, you moron. Spend some time on nuclear detente so we all don't die in a hydrogen bomb war. Why? I don't know.
Yeah, this is something I noticed too, that like during the Iran deal negotiations for the JCPOA, for example, something that hawks often want to do is they always want to like bring in every other conceivable issue. You can never just hammer out one agreement on one thing. They always want to complicate it with every single other accusation that's outstanding against this other regime and make them answer for it and make them pay for these things. And so it seems a common thing that hawks do to scuttle any kind of detente is bring in all these unrelated issues. And perhaps that's kind of happening with this whole Skripal thing. Which, if permit a brief digression, I agree that I don't think it's been proven conclusively at all that Russia is the only conceivable actor here, the only conceivable culprit for this alleged. We don't even know if these alleged Novichok agents have been synthesized or created. And if they have been, the guy who initially publicized their existence, the guy who alleged to work on the Russian chemical program, he says that they can be produced at any kind of like decently sophisticated commercial chemical facility. And so it's not at all clear that Russia would be the only power capable of producing such a nerve agent. And yet you have the UK and the US like proclaiming with certainty, it seems like, absolute certainty that Russia is behind it. And so I think that's kind of, it's worrying. And again, it's part of those mixed signals that kind of cuts against the good news of the announcement of talks.
Right. And they're so deceptive when they, portray this Sergei Skripal story. Again, Richard Engel, the MSNBC guy, was saying that any country like Russia could make these Novichok agents, right? These nerve agents. Well, countries like Russia include the United States and just about any other developed country in the world. Russia isn't like an exceedingly rich country or anything like that. They have a lot of nuclear weapons, but they destroyed all their biological weapons. Russia is far ahead of the United States in destruction of chemical weapons as agreed to in the treaty. And that's the other important thing to remember, is that if there is a legitimate grievance here, there is a world treaty on chemical weapons that will allow this grievance to be, redressed in some kind of international standard in court. And this requires the UK to provide a sample of the agent to Russians so they could examine it and then give some kind of response to the UK claim. But the Russians haven't been provided with any evidence in this poisoning whatsoever, and everybody's asking Russia to defend itself. But no evidence has actually been presented against Russia, other than everybody really thinks Russia did it.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Russia just recently, like within the last day or two, like approached the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is kind of like the international chemical weapons watchdog. And like Russia approached the OPCW asking them to like, hey, will you check this out? Will you look into this for us? Like they were being accused of using this chemical weapon. And as far as I know, you can maybe correct me, the OPCW rebuffed them and said like, nah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't see the response, but I just saw that, Russia said that they were going to look into it.
I see. Perhaps your viewers, your listeners can look into that. Don't quote me on that.
Moving on and this is a scary question, Will. What does John Bolton becoming National Security Advisor mean for U.S.-Russian relations? And, what is he going to be telling Donald Trump about Russia?
Yeah, so as we sort of laid out a little while ago, Bolton is definitely a Russia hawk. And so you can definitely expect that as National Security Advisor, he's going to be, telling Trump that, urging him to be more hawkish. Now, I'm not sure if he's part of this whole, if Bolton has jumped on the whole Russiagate thing. So I'm not sure if he'll be sort of pressuring him from that angle. However, I don't think Bolton doesn't need Russiagate to be a total Russia hawk. And so So yeah, we can expect that kind of policy to go in that direction. Now, Bolton, again, during his time as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control under George W. Bush, he helped to kill the landmark Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This is a treaty that was signed in 1972 that was meant to sort of slow down the Cold War arms race. And it was supposed to prevent either the Soviet Union or the United States from getting, like, adequate missile defenses. Because if one or the other side could get, like, a proper missile defense, then it would sort of defeat the purpose of nuclear deterrence. You know, there wouldn't be mutually assured destruction. One side might be able to, you know, pull out of a nuclear war. And so the ABM was supposed to sort of, like, prevent this kind of thing from being built, to slow down the arms race. But in 2002, officials like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, and particularly John Bolton, were involved in trying to kill this treaty, and eventually the U.S. actually unilaterally withdrew from the ABM in 2002. And Bolton was the one leading the diplomatic talks in Russia, trying to convince the Russians to do it bilaterally, to try to get it, you know, the Bush administration's position at the time was like, oh, the ABM is sort of like a relic of the Cold War, and it codifies a hateful relationship. But the Russians and Vladimir Putin were like, no, our position's the same as it was during the Cold War, that, like, maybe, you know, this is good for the arms race. You know, maybe we shouldn't get rid of this treaty. However, the U.S. ended up withdrawing from it anyway in 2002, totally unilaterally, and it pretty much has kicked up the arms race. You mentioned the hypersonic missiles and the nuclear cruise missile that Putin announced early in March in his big, long speech. I think that was sort of his equivalent of like a State of the Union address. And yeah, Russia obviously, we're sort of in an arms race with them again. They're obviously improving their nuclear and their ballistic missile capabilities in order to get around American defenses. The type of defenses that are only allowed for because that we stepped out of the ABM in 2002.
Right. All really good points. And just to expand on the withdrawal from the anti-missile treaty, the big thing there was, and Putin said this, I believe, to a former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in 2007, is that these missiles present a real threat to the Russians in that it gives American first strike capabilities. And while if you're in America, you think that means security, in Russia, that means the Americans could wipe you out and you can't say anything about it. And so while we demand absolute security at any price from the foreign, the rest of the world, the rest of the world is then guaranteed no security from the United States. You know what I mean? And so, I don't know. It seems that there's no recognition on the American side whatsoever that, our first strike capability would be a huge threat to Russia. And that's how Russia would perceive it. Just like if Russia had first strike capability against the United States. And there's no understanding, and Donald Trump doesn't seem to have any understanding either, that there has to be a balance. And the point of like mutually assured destruction and the START treaties and the non-proliferation treaty was to carefully take that balance and wind, like we destroy 10 nukes, they destroy 10 nukes. You destroy 50, they destroy 50. So you could reduce the number of nuclear weapons in a way where you maintain that balance of power, so everybody feels okay with what's going on. But then if one, side suddenly takes all the power, and that doesn't, mean that the other side's just going to take that laying down, just like America's would. And so that's the real problem here, I think.
Yeah. And when you're dealing with like nuclear standoffs and stuff, like the logic of the strategy is different from like a conventional war. Like typically you'd think, having good defenses means like it's good for stability. It makes things safer. But having good defenses against a nuclear weapon, if another country doesn't, it sort of makes things less stable because now the other country's super paranoid. You know what I mean? Like their trigger finger's way more itchy because they're paranoid. And so like it's a very, as you said, there's a balance. It's very delicate here. And just like brazenly stepping out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 is just very destabilizing to that sort of balance. And our new national security advisor was largely behind that.
Yeah, and a couple of, I think, personal things about John Bolton really troubled me on the Russia issue. And that is John Bolton's willingness to put pressure on international officials to either resign or accept his position, and also his willingness to put pressure either on his subordinates or on his co-workers to get them to present only his narrative and to isolate all other opinions away from the person that he's trying to influence. And so if you tell Donald Trump only that, hey, Russia's developed these really serious nuclear weapons, but just like the mainstream media did to the American people, don't also tell Donald Trump that in that speech, Vladimir Putin said, look, now we have that balance again. Let's work, to figure out a way to slow down this arms race. If John Bolton never tells that to Donald Trump, then I think Donald Trump, perceives and, if just present with that narrative a little bit correctly so, that Vladimir Putin is just looking for an arms race. And so that's one of my real concerns about John Bolton being in this position.
Yeah, there are stories about John Bolton. He's like so petty. I think again between the period of 2002 and 2004 when he was working on Iran nuclear diplomacy, he was known to like block memos going to Condoleezza Rice and going to Colin Powell in the State Department. Colin Powell was like his main adversary in the State Department. But yeah, he's so petty that like people he disagrees with, he like will prevent them from having all the information at their hands, And like you said, he'll urge his colleagues to resign if they don't accept his position. And like, he's super uncompromising. And so, yeah, this is the kind of guy, the National Security Advisor is an important position. Like, they're supposed to coordinate a lot of things, and they're supposed to sort of be someone who can like facilitate cooperation and agreement. And he's like the worst person for that position. It's incredible that he was selected for that.
Right. And then there was that recent story published in The Intercept about John Bolton threatening the children of I believe the man was Brazilian, but he was the head of some international agency to, kind of take John Bolton's position on the issue. And I'll go ahead and link to that article in the show notes page. Actually, I have a whole kind of archive of all these articles I've been collecting on John Bolton that I will link to in the show notes page. And you can see pretty much everything that me and Will talk about in today's show related to John Bolton will be in those archives. All right, well, how about moving on to North Korea? So I guess of the the three that we're talking about today, this seems to be the one with the least amount of, current news and events going on. But, really reviewing what's happened in 2018 is, we had the Winter Olympics. We had some good things going on between North and South Korea, even though Mike Pence was, stubbed the sister of Kim Jong-un. But, we move on from that. We have positive things, talks between the Koreans, and then the Koreans come to the South Koreans, that is, come to the Americans and say, hey, North Korea is serious about talking about denuclearization. And then Trump said, let's have a summit. So I think the summit is supposed to happen either by May or in May. So within the next month or two. And it's going to be between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Looks like the summit's going to happen in the Peace Village on the border, along the DMZ there. And the only, the other big news coming out of North-South Korea is that the United States is going ahead and carrying out the war games, the biggest annual war games in South Korea, with the South Koreans. However, the U.S. Has reduced the amount of time and the amount of troops that they're sending there. But if you notice in the media, or not in the media, but in the press releases, Kim Jong-un has not been vocally, upset about this. He hasn't been threatening. He hasn't been conducting military tests or military games like North Korea usually does as like a kind of counter show of force to the Americans. So, Will, do you think the summit's going to happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like there's some good trends on the North-South Korea issue. Like you said, there was the Olympics where for the first time, I don't know ever, or first time since in a long time, in decades at least, that the Koreans had they like competed on the same Olympic team. And then you had, like you said, Mike Pence sitting there like a cannibal, looking all glum and all, upset and grimacing and stuff, when it's like, this is a historic moment. This is great. And so, but yeah, again, mixed signals with that. So it seemed like the administration was trying to send its signal its disapproval with the whole Olympics thing. But then we have this much more substantial announcement of, I think it was before May or in May, they're going to allegedly meet. And I had heard that they could meet in the DMZ or somewhere just outside in South Korea or in DC or Moscow even, although those are less likely. But no, I think I'm not sure how likely it is. Again, it's a similar kind of question with the Russian meeting with Putin. However, it seems like they're going through with it, and it would be almost certainly a welcome development.
I guess, so if the talks do happen, Will, what do you expect could happen, should happen, may happen? I know one of the things that I'm concerned about is that it seems like especially the more hawkish people in the media are saying, okay, talk to North Korea, but if the North Koreans don't agree to immediately denuclearize, then it shows you that Kim Jong-un is just playing you. And so, what do you think here?
Yeah, that's certainly one risk of this, is that Trump goes in there sort of like guns blazing, art of the deal kind of style, and he doesn't get what he wants, and sort of that could easily then be spun as, see, we tried to discuss, we tried to negotiate with them, and now they only understand force. I could absolutely imagine John Bolton saying that, like for certain. I could see that coming out of his mouth.
Right. If there's one thing that Americans are good at in foreign policy, it's throwing up their hands after backing out on a deal and saying, well, we tried everything. They want death.
Right after we've changed the rules of the game and gone back on our word 12 times, and then we throw up our hands and say, see, we can't deal with them. All they understand is force. I noticed too that certain media outlets like CNBC was saying the meeting should be canceled. They were citing some Korea experts saying that Trump is not prepared for this and that it's going to be a disaster. And but I think that's for different reasons than I don't think he was making the argument that we're making here that he's going to try to go in there guns blazing and not get that and then use that as a reason to scuttle future talks. Like, I don't think that's what NBC was saying. But yeah, so there's a push, just like with the Putin meeting, there's a big push to make it not happen. And with the Syria withdrawal, you notice the media is like on all three of these questions, just horrible.
Absolutely. They're unequivocally opposed to every single one of these issues. It's not like on one of them, somebody's like, oh, well, getting along with Putin might not be too bad. I mean, Kim Jong-un, completely irrational and reasonable. Assad, war criminal, tortures people. But Putin, we could deal with Putin. Or, pick one of the three. They're bad on every single one of them. And not only are they bad on it, they predict catastrophe and world calamity if things start moving in a peaceful direction. It's not that, oh, well, if the United States withdraws from Syria, yeah, the Kurds probably aren't going to get as good as the deal as they would have if the United States was still there. And yeah, the Turks are probably going to get the Kurds out of Manbij. But overall, the world will go on. It's if the United States withdraws from Syria, then Iran will form a land bridge from Tehran to Beirut and supply Hezbollah and Hamas with missiles and even a nuclear bomb and then destroy Israel and, then the end times will be. I mean, this is seriously, the path that they go down.
It's just
every single time.
It's just like 1940 for them always, and Hitler is about to take over the world. Every single situation is portrayed in that light, it seems like. Like, that's the model for it.
Well, yeah, you have Mohammed bin Salman, crown prince and, de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia right now, running around the United States talking to the media, and they're calling Iran Hitler. And every single time the American journalist or correspondent or whoever the hell across from Mohammed bin Salman is just sitting there nodding their heads like, oh, yeah, yep, new Hitler of the Middle East, yep, mm-hmm.
He sounds like crazy Benjamin Netanyahu, like talking about like the Grand Mufti or something. It's exactly the same kind of propaganda there.
And some of the other propaganda that goes along with North Korea is this idea is that if Donald Trump goes and talks to Kim Jong-un, this will give him legitimacy. And Kim Jong-un having legitimacy somehow translates to North Korea being a world nuclear superpower. So Will Porter, do you want to explain to me, what Donald, what would be the image effects of Donald Trump talking to Kim Jong-un?
I'm not sure what that even means, like improving or somehow like improving North Korea's image. I mean, like the name North Korea is synonymous the world over with like despotism and hatred and poverty and horrible dictatorship. How could you possibly rehabilitate this regime just by meeting with them once? That makes no sense. And North Korea is around. They've been around for decades. They're here to stay. They're not going to go away. Whether their existence does not depend upon whether we acknowledge them. The United States acknowledges them. They're here. They have nuclear weapons. We've dealt with them before. We've negotiated with North Korea in the past to some success, but of course it's also to some failure. But nonetheless, there's nothing significant is going to happen to North Korea's image if Donald Trump meets Kim Jong-un. It almost makes no sense to me.
Right. Well, on one hand, you'll have Rachel Maddow say that, and then on the other hand, she'll talk about how Trump is destroying the American image in the rest of the world and how everybody thinks the Americans are idiots. And so you kind of have to pick one, right? Either our president's a worldwide laughingstock and buffoon who nobody cares about, or he's so powerful and so noble and so revered that him going and shaking hands with somebody gives that person magic legitimacy.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has this reputation of being like unilateral and not being very diplomatic and stuff, but every time he tries to, it seems like, reach out and make diplomatic overtures, he's completely piled on by the media, and they're just like, you can't do that. Putin, interfered in the election. Assad is a war criminal. Kim Jong-un, cannot be tolerated. They're beyond the pale. And so it's odd how they, their criticisms are contradictory.
Yeah. I also find it interesting when they say, well, it's legitimacy within North Korea. Like, somehow the North Korean government doesn't own Photoshop. And if that's really what's gonna, enlighten Kim Jong-un to the, North Korean people, they can't, Photoshop a picture of Donald Trump shaking hands with Kim Jong-un or something like that. You know what I mean? It just seems completely ridiculous to me that it would be the actual event of Donald Trump sitting down talking to Kim Jong-un that would make all the people of his country say, oh, well, I guess we have a good leader.
Right. Somehow the Hermit Kingdom, like engaging, people call North Korea the Hermit Kingdom because it's very isolated and insular. And somehow them engaging with the world is going to be a bad thing. I don't understand.
All right. Well, so John Bolton coming in. I think, on my personal opinion, I think of all of these, John Bolton scares me the most on North Korea. I think he's the most hawkish on North Korea. I think Trump's a little bit worse on that issue than the other two already. But what do you think that John Bolton becoming NSA means for the situation and, potential war, nuclear war with North Korea?
Yeah, I think to get some kind of context on what John Bolton's appointment as National Security Advisor means for the North Korean situation, we should look back at the agreed framework deal that was signed with North Korea under the Clinton administration in 1994. And the agreed framework, the basic idea was to sort of like temporarily halt North Korea's nuclear program and replace its plutonium reactors with light water reactors, which I think are less useful in like the waste of a light water reactor. I don't think is useful in producing nuclear weapons. And so that was the idea. That was the agreement signed under Clinton. And this is supposed to happen over several years. And so I think it was like 2002 or 2003 when this is all supposed to finally be done with. However, George W. Bush, of course, is elected in 2000, and not long after that, the same old usual suspects, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and of course John Bolton, come in and start trying to kill the agreed framework. And so in 2002, Bush gave that State of the Union address, the Axis of Evil thing. And in Bolton's memoir, he wrote that that speech, that State of the Union address, he took that as a signal to starting to try to kill the agreed framework. Okay, North Korea is now beyond the pale. They're part of the evil axis of the Axis of Evil. And, we can't deal with them anymore. And so in July of 2002, Bolton is the one who cited this American intelligence assessment and accused North Korea of buying centrifuges and other nuclear gear in 2001, the year prior. And he accused them of enriching uranium and violating this sort of, this other agreement that North Korea had with the South. Although the agreed framework had, I think, settled all the outstanding issues with that prior agreement. So really Bolton had no leg to stand on. However, all of these accusations and all of this sort of trickery from the United States in these negotiations, which were supposed to really lead toward denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. And by 2003, we basically pushed North Korea to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they've still withdrawn from, and continue pursuing nukes, which they still have. And they're still, I forget when their last test was, but it was within the last year or so, I think.
Right, and their first test was in 2006, within a couple of years of the United States, withdrawing or forcing North Korea out of the agreed framework. I know, there's all those accusations going around out there that North Korea was violating the agreed framework. And it seems to be that, the truth is probably there, that North Korea wasn't living up to the letter of the deal, but the Americans weren't either. And so, when you have somebody like John Bolton, who looks at that situation and doesn't say, what can we do to repair the deal? What can we do to keep North Korea as far away from nuclear weapons as possible? And his answer is, hammer fist, North Koreans have to give in to all the Americans' wills, or, we're going to go to war with them. And it's just a completely insane policy. And it's not even, can't even be ideally based in reason. I mean, in 2003, 2002 and 2003, while, Bolton's trying to screw up the agreed framework, the United States is preparing for war in Iraq. I mean, what did he think was going to happen? That we were going to fight a war in Iraq, Iran, and North Korea? That's certainly what he was advocating for that time. And so it seems like he has a completely unrealistic ideal of, what could be accomplished by U.S. military might.
Yeah, it seems John Bolton's sort of modus operandi is always to pressure, he hates arms control agreements. He hates any kind of, diplomatic talks with certain countries that he just doesn't like. And so his MO is to sort of push them and harass them to where they leave the deal, and then they can more easily be demonized. In the case of the ABM with Russia, he tried to get Russia to do it with us bilaterally, but we just ended up having to, at all costs, we'll leave the treaty anyway. But yeah, Bolton is just incredible that in 2002, right in the lead up of the Iraq War, you have all this other stuff that the American government's doing, totally screwing up its diplomatic relations with all these other countries. And so as we're, building the case for war with Saddam, John Bolton's here trying to screw up the anti-ballistic missile treaty. He's interfering in Iran nuclear negotiations and making all these crazy accusations about Iran being a nuclear weapons threat. And of course, he's doing the same thing with North Korea. And so almost behind the scenes, a lot of people, of course, remember the Iraq War, but they don't necessarily remember these things that John Bolton was doing in the lead up to that war.
Right. And it's worth mentioning that in the past year, John Bolton has written an op-ed that I think ran in the Wall Street Journal explaining how the United States can consider North Korea an imminent threat and can legally go to war with North Korea. And so I'm sure if you're the North Koreans, that's kind of scary that the new National Security Advisor believes the Americans have the right to go to war with North Korea. And then just I believe in the days before he was announced to be the new National Security Advisor, John Bolton said, I believe on Fox News, that the United States should look for Libyan-style denuclearization from North Korea, and explicitly said that Donald Trump should tell the North Koreans that we're going to send a boat in a couple weeks and a plane in a couple weeks, and you're going to load your nuclear program on it, and then we'll, talk about other stuff from there.
Yeah, that's exactly what I hope Trump does not do when he meets with Un. It's just like that kind of talk.
Right, and I've got a link to an article by Peter Van Buren in the show notes page, and Peter Van Buren is a longtime veteran of the State Department and understands international diplomacy, and in that article he explains that, there has to be a trust but verified process. The North Koreans have to believe that if they're giving up their nuclear weapons, they're doing so in exchange for security from the Americans, and if this process isn't done slowly, then you could see the North Koreans not want to buy in. And so if that's what John Bolton tells Donald Trump has to happen, it seems like a poison pill of the whole talks in general. Also, for Kim Jong-un, that has to be a pretty scary dog whistle, right? We know that one of the reasons Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons is because he doesn't want to end up like Muammar Gaddafi. And so John Bolton is suggesting that the Americans pursue the path that they did in Libya. Kim Jong-un has to look at that and say, no, I'm not gonna, that's not gonna happen.
Right. He might interpret that to mean leave you in the side of the road dead in a gutter. That's what happened to Gaddafi when he got rid of his, all his old nuclear equipment. And yeah, that Wall Street Journal article is crazy. It's called The Legal Case for Striking North Korea First. And so that also, John Bolton, he doesn't make a secret of this stuff. He writes op-eds in big newspapers telling you what his beliefs are. And so it's definitely instructive to go read them.
All right, well, before I wrap up, there's one last thing I want to talk about on John Bolton, and that was his recent interview on Tucker Carlson. And I know you were a pretty big fan of this interview. Yeah. But just, to end on a little bit of a lighter note and everything like that, what was your favorite part of this interview? It's only 2 minutes, guys. I'll link to it in the show notes page. It's definitely worth watching.
Yeah, I think my favorite part is Bolton's completely incoherent argument that the Israelis in 1981 bombing the Osirak reactor in Iraq, that was somehow a deterrent. He always refers to this. He invokes this Osirak reactor bombing. He loves it, that the Israelis took it upon themselves to attack an Arab country, their nuclear program. However, if you're John Bolton and you also believe that Saddam Hussein was again a weapons of mass destruction threat in the early 2000s and the lead up to the Iraq War, and so how do you argue that this bombing in the 1980s was successful at keeping Iraq from getting a weapon when you also believe that Iraq had weapons just a couple decades later? And so I thought that was a funny, this guy does not even make sense. He doesn't even on the face of it, it's just a contradictory argument. But he just says it. It makes him sound smart, I guess. He knows of the of the reactor and of the event. But it doesn't follow. His argument is completely a non sequitur, basically.
Right. That interview leaves me with one question: is John Bolton that stupid, or is he, just that, much of a liar? it's really hard to accept the second one as being true because they understands how many people he's killing. But I don't know, man. It seems to me like he's an awfully terrible liar and a terrible, terrible person.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, he's somehow managed to be like, I don't know, more hawkish than the actual neocons. Like, cause he's kind of like, he's more of a fellow traveler with neocons, but it's amazing that he's like almost managed to outdo them on a lot of these questions.
Yeah, I do find that amazing that everybody thinks he's a neocon because he's as bad as the neocons on all the war issues. But I think he even turns out to be a little bit worse because he's not a neoconservative. He's just something of a conservative war hawk. It's terrifying.
Absolutely.
All right, well, unless you have anything else to add, that's where I'm going to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we covered everything.
All right, well, tell everybody where they could find all of your really awesome work.
Yeah, you guys can check out some of my newer stuff. Kyle and I's article is at Consortiumnews. I'm hoping to have another one there soon on Ukraine, but we'll see how that goes. You can find me at the Libertarian Institute. I have an author archive there. Just search Will Porter there. I have an author archive at a site called The Daily Sheeple, which you can easily find pinned at the top of my Twitter page. And my Twitter is WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And I think that's everything.
All right. Thanks, everybody, so much for tuning in. If you want to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. It's on the homepage there, right underneath Scott Horton Show. You can find it at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. The Facebook page is Libertarian Union. Twitter at KYAAALE. I'm now on MeWe, BitChute, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Spotify. Man, I think that's all of them.
Dang.
Check out the page if you want to support the show on Patreon. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, Kyle.